This is Cave-in-Rock, a landmark in southern Illinois known not just for its unique features, but for who once took refuge within it. The Harpe brothers ravaged much of the early United States, killing men, women, and even babies. Their crimes were notorious enough in 1799 for the governor of Kentucky to label them enemies of human happiness. They would eventually take shelter here at Cave-in-Rock, among other outlaws. But the Harpe brothers were so wicked that their fellow outlaws would eventually expel them from the cave, where they would soon after meet their demise. This is the story of America's first serial killers and how they met their end. Born sometime in the mid-1700s, the original names of the brothers were Joshua and William Harper, at some point changing their names to Micajah, Big Harpe, and Wiley, Little Harpe. In their adulthood, Big Harpe was described as being a robust man of 6 feet. He had short, curly black hair and is said to have had a fleshy face. Little Harpe, on the other hand, was shorter and had black hair not as curly as Big Harpe's. He is said to have had a meager face and was, quote, ill-looking. The Harpe brothers grew up in the Carolinas, surrounded by revolutionaries who hated the British. This was a problem considering their parents were of Scottish descent and loyal to the British. Tensions would get so bad that a local mob would form and lynch the Harpe brothers' parents in front of their eyes. The Harpe brothers would see this horror and flee into the forest, where the brothers were then later adopted by a local Cherokee tribe. The tribe would teach the boys how to hunt and scavenge and live off the land. But since the boys shared the Cherokee tribe's hatred of the revolutionaries, they would also learn how to kill and torture their enemies. It is not known for exactly how long the boys lived with the Cherokees, but not long after they lived with them, the Revolutionary War would break out. The Harpe brothers would take the opportunity and fight on the side of the British. It was here that the two would partake in a British gang that would kidnap, rob, and colonial women. In one instance, the pair would kidnap 4 teenage girls, but Captain James Wood of the Colonial Army would fire on the brothers as they were escaping with the women, saving one of them. Captain Wood's son, Frank Wood, would later engage the Harpes in battle, and is said to have had Big Harpe's head in his sights, fired, but missed the shot. As the Revolutionary War came to an end, the Harpes would flee their home state filled with revolutionaries in favor of Tennessee to begin a new life of lawlessness. Now in Tennessee, the brothers would change their name from Harper to Harpe, as Harper was a common name amongst British loyalists, I guess. The Harpes would live a barbaric life, befriending some exiled Cherokee tribesmen. Together they would rob, torture, and kill Indian and white alike, a rampage that lasted years. One day in 1797, the Harpes decided that they wanted to settle down and live a quieter life. They decided to settle in Knoxville, Tennessee, a town that had garnered a reputation of being filled with degenerates who liked to swear, drink, and get a little naughty. After settling in Beaver Creek, just a few miles outside of Knoxville, the pair would build a cabin and start to interact with the town locals. It was around this time that the Harpes would entangle themselves with 3 women. One was Sarah Rice, a minister's daughter and the wife of Little Harpe; Susan Wood, who was the daughter of Captain James Wood, you might remember earlier, who Big Harpe forced to marry him; and Betsy, who was a concubine shared by both of the brothers. You might see the last name Roberts used in Susan's marriage certificate, and that's because the Harpes would use the last name Roberts every time that they wanted to confuse officials. The Harpes and their women would live in the cabin that they had built and would engage the locals in trade. But it wouldn't take long for the town of Knoxville to realize that the goods the Harpes were putting up for sale were originally stolen, and thus the locals turned on the Harpes. In response, the Harpe brothers would burn down many of the town homes in preparation to leave for good. Edward Teal, a Knoxville horse rancher, would have his horses stolen by the Harpes, and angered, assembled a team of 2 other men to chase down and capture the Harpe brothers. The 3 men were successful, capturing the Harpe brothers and bringing them back to Knoxville. But upon their return, the Harpe brothers would escape. Before the Harpes left Knoxville for good, they would take one last chance to enact their revenge on Knoxville. Later that night, they would burst into a local bar, Hugh's Rowdy Groggery, and brutalize the customers. One of the customers, a man named Johnson, was last seen alive there. The subsequent discovery of Johnson's body, ripped open and filled with stones in a nearby body of water, would be the first documented murder of the Harpe brothers, which would go on to spark fear across Tennessee, Kentucky, and other sections of the Middle West. The Harpes would reunite with their 3 women and travel northwest into Kentucky. During this journey, the Harpes would kill 4 confirmed travelers. One was a peddler named Peyton, who had been killed for his horse in Knox County. 2 of them were Paca and Bates, traveling from Maryland. It is said that this pair joined the Harpes in their journey, and at some point Little Harpe shot the Marylanders. Bates would die instantly, while Paca was knocked to the ground, where Big Harpe would move in to split his skull with a tomahawk. Their 4th victim would be a traveler they came about at a public breakfast house at Big Rock Castle River. This traveler, Thomas Langford, upon seeing the sorry state of the Harpes and their 3 women, would offer to buy the 5 of them breakfast before settling off on their travels together. The Harpes would repay this kindness by killing Thomas. Mr. Langford's corpse was discovered by locals who had recognized the man dining with the Harpes earlier, and this would arouse the local population to action. A prominent merchant of Stanford, Kentucky, Joseph Ballinger, assembled a pursuing party that stalked the Harpes 8 miles southwest of Stanford. When the party found the Harpes, all 5 of them were sitting on a log at the base of a valley. The pursuing party rushed the Harpes so quick and violently that, quote, resistance or escape was impossible. While being apprehended, the Harpes and their 3 wives would give their last name as Roberts to confuse officials. In December of 1798, the Harpes were transported 10 miles from Stanford, Kentucky to here in Danville, which at the time was one of the most important places in Kentucky because of its court and jail system. Today, the town of Danville has constructed replicas of what these buildings used to look like. The one you see behind me is a replica of the jail the Harpe brothers were imprisoned in. You know where this is going. I know where this is going. The Harpes would obviously escape this shack of a prison on March 16th after just over a month of imprisonment. But where things get interesting is that the Harpes escaped this prison seemingly with ease, but left their women behind, all 3 of whom would give birth in their cells over the next few weeks. Suspicion would later be placed on the jailer because shortly after the Harpes escaped, he would go on to resign his position as jailer, buy a farm, and retire, the thought process being that he was somehow bribed by the Harpes. Nevertheless, on Monday, April 15th, 1799, these 3 women were tried in court for the crimes of their so-called lovers. But since these women were now single mothers, the court of Danville took pity on them and let them go free, despite being found guilty on several counts. Upon this decision, the women expressed a desire to return to Knoxville and start fresh lives. Arrangements were made for the women and their 3 babies to have fresh clothes, some money, and a horse to assist them in their 150-mile journey. As the mothers and their children set foot on their journey, spies were sent after them to monitor their movements in case the Harpe brothers showed up. Within 30 miles of their departure, the spies reported that the women hastily traded their horse for a canoe, veered course, and disappeared into the wilderness. The Harpes had successfully rendezvoused with their women and children, but the death of Thomas Langford and the Harpes' subsequent escape from justice had sent the citizens of Kentucky and Tennessee into a frenzy. James Garrard, the governor of Kentucky, would label the Harpes enemies of human happiness and set a $300 bounty on the capture of each of the Harpe brothers. Lynching parties were thus assembled across the United States to find and kill the Harpe brothers. In this frenzy, the Harpe brothers are confirmed to have killed 4 people on their way here to Cave-in-Rock. One was a 13-year-old boy whose body had been found cut to pieces and thrown into a sinkhole near the Barren River. A man named Dooley was killed near Edmonton. Another man named Stump had been found cut open and stuffed with stones 8 miles south of Bowling Green. And finally, an unnamed person was killed at the mouth of the Saline River in Illinois. Inside this cave, the Harpe brothers, their 3 women, and their 3 children would live, using it as a base of operations for their new escapade as pirates. Led by Captain Samuel Mason, this new band of pirates would raid ferries and travelers floating down the Ohio River here, which led to the famed Mississippi River. Though Samuel Mason was a known killer, it is said that he found the sheer bloodlust of the Harpe brothers disturbing. In one instance, Big and Little Harpe would chance upon 2 lovers sitting above a cliff like this one. The 2, not being able to help themselves, would push the lovers off the cliff 40 feet below. To the surprise of everyone, they would land safely into a pile of sand beneath them and run over to Cave-in-Rock to tell the pirates what had transpired. This tension would come to a head in May of 1799 when the pirates would secure 3 prisoners during a raid. The Harpe brothers, unsatisfied, would take one of the prisoners to the top of a cliff, strip him naked, mount him on top of a horse, blindfolded the horse, and sent the horse running off the 100-foot cliff into the jagged rocks below. The sight of the carnage was said to be so gruesome that Samuel Mason and the rest of his pirates banished the Harpe brothers immediately, presumably only letting them live out of sympathy for their women and children. Rumors were naturally spreading about the Harpes and their whereabouts, as it had only been a few months since the Kentucky governor had set his $300 bounty on the brothers. The prevailing thought at the time was that the Harpes would continue their crime trail northwest into Illinois and Missouri. But in July of 1799, the citizens of Kentucky and Tennessee were shocked to hear of 2 gruesome deaths not 25 miles from Knoxville. On July 24th, 2 days after realizing the Harpes had returned to the Knoxville area, William Ballard would be found cut open and stuffed with stones in an attempt to submerge his body. Several official hunting parties would be sent out after the Harpes to no avail. The Harpes were skilled at evading detection and would outflank every prediction made to their whereabouts. This killing spree would continue with the killing of James Brassel, who had been beaten and had his throat cut at Marrowbone Creek. The Harpes would also stay the night at a cabin lived in by John Groves and his 13-year-old son. The Harpes split each of their skulls with an axe. Near Mammoth Cave, the Harpes would kill a young girl and dashed the brains of a young boy onto a tree. This was done, however, with 3 women and 3 babies in their party. The wails of the babies endangered and angered Big Harpe, and the brothers would frequently threaten the children's lives if the women did not keep them quiet. One day near Russellville, Kentucky, Big Harpe would make good on his threat. He would grab his own child from Susan Wood's arms, then, swinging it by the feet, would smash the child into a tree before slinging its corpse as far as he could into the forest. At this point in the story, the Harpes were neck-deep in Kentucky, surrounded by enemies. They had to have known that they were running on borrowed time. Now enters James Tompkins, the first of several men the Harpes would regret meeting. Big and Little Harpe were traveling in search of bounty hunters to kill and supplies to steal. And in Deer Creek, the 2, disguising themselves as merchants, would chance upon the residence of James Tompkins, who they questioned and asked to have a meal with. Tompkins graciously hosted the 2 for dinner and told them all that he could about the surrounding area. Big Harpe, to act even more convincing, even said grace before the meal. After, Big Harpe asked Tompkins if he had shot any venison lately. Tompkins, again telling the truth, had told the brothers no because he had ran out of gunpowder. And in one of the only recorded acts of grace in his entire life, Big Harpe took out his powder horn and poured Tompkins a teacup full of gunpowder and gifted it to the man before leaving. That very same night, the Harpes would travel just a half a mile to the farmhouse of Squire Silas McBee. McBee was a known outlaw hunter, so it was probable that the Harpe brothers had traveled there with the sole intent of killing him. The brothers were stopped by the 6 dogs McBee kept for hunting, and the commotion of the dogs alerted McBee to the outlaws who were seen fleeing from those dogs. The Harpes would continue their retreat 4 miles northwest before chancing upon the residence of Moses Stegall, who had left his wife and 4-month-old son alone with Major William Love to guard them while he was away. The Harpes pretended to be bounty hunters inquiring about the whereabouts of themselves, and Mrs. Stegall offered the two a bed to share alongside Major William Love. When Love fell asleep, Big Harpe would split his skull with a tomahawk. The brothers then turned their attention to Mrs. Stegall, cutting her child's throat before killing her, setting fire to the house, and stealing 2 horses to flee. Silas McBee, upon seeing the fire, rallied the help of William Grissom to investigate. McBee and Grissom arrived at the scene at roughly the same time as Moses Stegall to discover the horror the Harpe brothers had left in their wake. The morning after the burning of the Stegall residence, a team of 7 men banded together to chase down and kill the Harpe brothers once and for all. John Leeper, Matthew Christian, and Neville Lindsay were gathered personally by Moses Stegall, whose wife and infant son had just been murdered by the Harpes. Accompanying them were Squire Silas McBee and William Grissom, who both hastily investigated the burning Stegall residence, and the final member of their party was James Tompkins, who dined with the Harpe brothers just a few days earlier. The story of the following chase comes primarily from McBee's perspective. On August 24th, 1799, the 7 men followed the trail of the Harpes for many miles before discovering the fresh corpses of dogs, a sign of the vicious murderers. They would then continue to follow this trail until chancing upon a group of 3 men holding guns on an adjacent hillside. Silas McBee is the first to spot them and shouts, "There they are!" In a panic, Big Harpe mounts his horse to escape, while Little Harpe flees on foot in the opposite direction. The 3rd man amongst the chaos charges towards Silas McBee, who, perceiving him as a threat, fires 2 bullets into the man. Moses Stegall, upon realizing who this is, shouts at McBee, "Don't shoot, it's George Smith." Smith would later recover from his wounds and apologize to McBee for charging at the pursuers. In the dense forest, the men chased after Big Harpe before finding Little Harpe's wife left alone. The men interrogated the woman and asked where Big Harpe had gone. She told the men that Big Harpe had just been there, taking his wife and concubine, mounting them on horseback before taking off again. The group then asked the woman to point in the direction they had gone, which she did. McBee, who did not want to let the Harpes escape again, immediately pointed his gun at the woman's head and said he would execute her on the spot if she was lying. She then proceeded to point in the same direction. Squire McBee would then stay behind to guard the woman while the other 6 dashed ahead. Not long after, they would find Big Harpe and his women dismounted from the horse, and again panicking, Big Harpe would mount his horse and leave the other 2 women. Tompkins and Lindsay stayed with the women while the other 4 pursued. Leeper, whose gun was not working, took Tompkins' gun for the pursuit. In the 10-mile chase, Stegall, Christian, and Grissom all fired at Big Harpe and missed. Leeper, using Tompkins' gun, took aim and struck down Big Harpe using the very same gunpowder Big Harpe had gifted Tompkins just a few days earlier. As Big Harpe lay dying, Leeper took off Big Harpe's shoe, filled it with water, and gave it for the criminal to drink as he confessed to 20 murders. When asked why he had committed so many heinous acts, Big Harpe simply responded that he had been badly treated and consequently was disgusted with all mankind. The only crime he is said to have had remorse for was the killing of his infant daughter. Stegall, in revenge for his dead wife and son, cut off Harpe's head and made the wife carry it for many miles before ultimately mounting it on a spike in Webster County, Kentucky. This monument serves as a rough marker where the head stood for many years. And while the head was obviously taken down, it still serves as a warning to future outlaws. The Harpe women that were captured all once again stood trial for the crimes of their so-called lovers, and once again were let go. This time, when given their freedom, they actually went on to lead new lives across the country, getting married and having more children. But with Big Harpe dead, the American people turned their attention to find and kill little wily Harpe. We return to the story of the Harpes in 1802 with two men, Captain Samuel Mason and John Sutton. Samuel Mason, who you'll remember earlier, had plundered with the Harpes here at Cave-in-Rock. He had since moved his base of operations to Mississippi, where he now stole along the Mississippi River and the Natchez Trace. Sutton will play an important role later. On April 15th, Mississippi Governor William Claiborne would address his military forces on the threat of Mason's pirates. In his letter, he writes, "I have received information that a set of pirates and robbers who infest the Mississippi River, a certain Samuel Mason and a man by the name of Harpe." It wouldn't take long for rumors to spread about the return of Little Harpe, and combined with the notorious crimes of Captain Samuel Mason, a $900 bounty was placed on the outlaws. Captain Mason paid little attention to the bounty placed on his head. He laughed at these rumors and felt confident in his ability to continue to outrun the law. While Mason would never be captured by American authorities, in January of 1803, he would be apprehended by the Spanish, who at this point controlled the territories of Florida and Louisiana. The Spanish would then hold trial for Mason and many of his gang, including John Sutton, under the suspicion that they had committed piracy under Spanish territory. After many testimonies and cross-examinations, the Spanish could not prove that Mason or Sutton had committed piracy in Spanish territory and had no authority to punish them as such. So, in February, the Spanish had arranged to transfer the Mason gang over to the American authorities. But on March 26, 1803, Mason and Sutton escaped Spanish, and the bounty on Mason's head increased to $1,000. At the end of July, a man by the name of James May would happen upon Samuel Mason and shoot him in the head. John Sutton would then join James May and present the head of Samuel Mason in American court to collect the bounty placed on it. But as the judge was making the certificate of payment, a traveler stepped in and had the two men arrested. The traveler claimed to know John Sutton as Wily Harpe. That's right, Wily Harpe had disguised himself as John Sutton for years. In fact, it's even disputed whether or not Samuel Mason had recognized Harpe from their escapades as pirates in Cave-in-Rock. Witnesses were called upon in Tennessee and Kentucky, and the smoking gun came from a witness who identified Harpe in the Danville jail, saying, quote, "If he is Harpe, he has a mole on his neck and two toes grown together on one foot." On February 8th, 1804, Little Harpe was executed by hanging somewhere along the Natchez Trace. Like his brother, his head was cut off and placed upon a spike as a warning to all future outlaws. I would like to preface that while researching this topic, I found many sources to be contradictory. For example, one source said that Susan and Betsy were sisters that the Harpes met on a slave plantation in Virginia, which means that Susan Wood would not have been the daughter of Captain James Wood, who the Harpes fought during the Revolutionary War. In fact, I even question whether or not the Harpes fought in the Revolutionary War, considering that some place Big Harpe as being 30 years old at the time of his death, which, if you go back to the Revolutionary War, would have made him about 8 years old at the time it started. Many years, names, dates seem fuzzy. and the details that I presented to you were the ones that I found to be most prominent. But the details of this story are not the point. The Harpe brothers, this legend, it paints a very real picture of what life must have been like across the new frontier. It seems that as American civilization was being crafted, entangled within it was the barbaric truth that at any moment a monster could come out of the wilderness and end it all.